I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
This week on the Magnificast, we're going to reflect a little bit on a recent report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also read a little bit of Ecosocialism by Michael Löwy. Two things that I guess go together.
Or at least they'll maybe not make you feel better, but make you feel like there's something to do. And that helps a little bit.
Keep you busy at the end of the world. That's what everyone needs.
That's right. That's what I need, really, because I'm not creative enough to have a good time at the end of it. So just look busy the whole time. That's my strategy.
Yeah, Ecosocialism, and then the subtitle of this book is A Fidget Spinner for the End of the World. All right.
That's right.
Sorry, Michael Löwy, that's actually not true. Okay, well, you've probably seen it if you've been on the internet, but this week on the Washington Post, a UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report came out, or the IPCC, as I like to call them. The report is, I guess, infamous at this point for being pretty catastrophic and telling us about how we're going to all slowly cook to death on this planet. If you haven't read it, I don't know, I guess it's surprising, but climate change is real, global warming is happening, and it's going to get worse. The Washington Post's reporting on this climate change report says this. Most strikingly, the document says the world's annual carbon dioxide emissions, which amount to more than 40 billion tons per year, would have to be on an extremely steep downward path by 2030 to either hold the world entirely below 1.5 degrees Celsius or allow only a brief overshoot in temperatures. Okay, so what they're saying is that we got to get things under control by 2030 or things are going to get bad. The Washington Post report goes on to say, current promises made by countries as part of the Paris Climate Agreement would lead to about 3 degrees Celsius or 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by the end of the century. And the Trump administration recently released an analysis assuming about 4 degrees Celsius or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100 if the world takes no action at all. Okay, so things are pretty dire, it seems, and we don't have a lot of time.
It's worth pointing out, too, just to, I guess, drive home the gravity of these kinds of analyses, that these are being released by people like the Trump administration and, a UN panel, not exactly known for being super, analytically radical or kind of facing up to, the actual material conditions around them. So if those bodies are willing to say that sort of a thing, I mean, I try not to be too much of a doomsayer or anything like that, but I just always assume it's probably worse than the UN thinks.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. I mean, the thing about the Trump administration's science team or whatever releasing this is kind of telling because, once he took office, you couldn't even say climate change from the federal government.
Right.
The EPA changed it, the Pentagon changed all of their terminology. They still planned for it, but still. So yeah, you're right. It's probably is more dire because of that. It is all kind of scary. In response to these scary numbers and, probable ecological collapse, CNN does have some good suggestions about things we can do. Thanks CNN for these really hot tips at the end of the world. CNN suggests you can do some really radical things like buy an electric car. You can take a bus or a train rather than drive your fossil fuel car around. They highly suggest, this is the funniest one to me. They highly suggest to buy a smart thermostat, like a Nest, like buy a Nest for your house. And then eat less meat, which I'm down with, but like, I don't know, it's not going to save us probably in the end.
Yeah, it's amazing that all of their suggestions are actually advertisements.
I know, no kidding. The CNN Hot Tips End of the World ad is brought to you by Tesla, Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. Your new vegan butcher down the street.
Yeah, that's it. So thanks, CNN. I guess those are some things we can do. But hey, CNN, I got the hottest tip of the century for you. The number one best thing you can do to sort of thwart climate change is become an eco-socialist.
That's what I'm talking about.
Wrap air horns.
A hot take for a hot planet.
Yeah. So this week, in kind of response to some of these like scary environmental reports, we kind of thought it would be good to think through what it is that Marxists have to say about socialism and ecology. There's a lot of people we probably could have turned to on this, but we decided to turn to Michael Löwy's book on ecosocialism because it's short and really good. So
yeah, it is.
Get it or something.
Both of those things. It's super accessible. You can hand it to somebody who's never read a word about socialism, and they'll understand a little bit more of it by the end, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. So in Michael Löwy's book, he does a few things. He kind of introduces the idea of ecosocialism. He walks through kind of like how it's different than regular Marxisms of the big state communist countries, scare quotes, and talks about a lot of indigenous struggle in Latin America. It's worth noting that Michael Löwy is like French-Brazilian, so he has that sort of perspective, which I appreciate. I learned a lot of cool stuff about Evo Morales in this book, and that's good.
Yeah, it is. That's worth the price of admission, for sure.
Yeah, love that Evo.
Yeah, well, let's get into it right at the top. He has a great little chapter called What is Ecosocialism? And it's a lot of things. We'll kind of uncover it a little more as we go, but he does a really good job of summarizing it in two kind of nice little paragraphs here. He says, the central premise of ecosocialism, already suggested by the term itself, is that non-ecological socialism is a dead end, and a non-socialist ecology cannot confront the present ecological crisis. So that's one central premise, put sort of negatively. I guess that's the negatively stated premise. But he also has some kind of positive articulations too. So he says, ecosocialist reasoning rests on two essential arguments. I'm going to read the first one, Matt, and then I'm going to have you read the other one, because they're kind of long. The first argument, he says, the present mode of production and consumption of advanced capitalist countries, which is based on the logic of boundless accumulation of capital, profits, and economies, or of capital, profits, and commodities, waste of resources, ostentatious consumption, and the accelerated destruction of the environment, cannot in any way be extended to the whole planet without a major ecological crisis. According to recent calculations, if one extended to the whole world the average energy consumption of the United States, the known reserves of petroleum would be exhausted in 19 days. And this book was not written yesterday, so who knows. Thus, this system necessarily operates on the maintenance and aggravation of the glaring inequality between North and South. So there's a whole lot of issues bound up in it, but that's the first argument that is constitutive of ecosocialism.
It's a good argument. The second argument is also good. He says this: whatever the cause, the continuation of capitalist progress and the expansion of civilization based on market economy, even under this brutally inequitable form in which the world's majority consumes less, directly threatens in the middle term, any exact forecast would be risky, the very survival of the human species. The protection of the natural environment is thus a humanist imperative.
So there's a lot of negativity, obviously, still in these as well. But the reason I say they're kind of positive articulations is that, or positive ways of putting the premise of ecosocialism, is that they're not like totally acidic, right? So the first argument is basically that we can't consume or produce the same kinds of things we're doing in capitalism, and that means we should do some other things that he'll go on to talk about, and we can sort of do some more of that. And the second argument is to say that there's a humanist sort of impulse to actually making these kinds of criticisms. It's not just a kind of nihilism. It's based on like a faith in the human spirit or something like that. We've talked about that before, and I mean, you could take that humanism or leave it in Marxism, but Löwy has taken it, and I think it does some good rhetorical work.
Yeah, I think so too. It reminds me of a tweet I saw earlier today, I guess, where someone said that like sort of the nihilism in face of ecological collapse is necessarily fascist, in the sense that like it's just like we're all equally dead and that whole kind of thing. Sort of praising the destruction of humanity is a fascist impulse, I suppose. Not I suppose, it is for sure. Anyways, but the hope to sort of save the environment in some way so it's habitable to some life is a better impulse that we should probably think through.
Yeah, totally. Well, this all sounds kind of like broad strokey and, you know, really stage setting kind of moves that he's doing, and it is the beginning of the book. But what's really great, I think, about this book is that there's a lot of times when he just creates like bulleted lists of actual proposals or quotes manifestos or declarations that do that as well. And he has been involved in preparing some of these statements, so they're published in the book. Before we kind of get into some of the theoretical stuff, it might be helpful to just have some of these practical demands out on the table first. This is sort of backwards in the book because it all comes at the end, but I don't know, at least for me, when I'm reading it, the whole time he's talking about different theoretical stuff, I'm like, yeah, but what does this actually mean? And it might help to have some spoilers up front. So let's just go through a few of them. First, ecosocialism proposes radical transformations in the energy system by replacing carbon-based fuels and biofuels with clean sources of power under community control: wind, geothermal, wave, and above all, solar power. He talks about solar communism or solar socialism in this book, and that's an extremely cool thing to say.
Yeah, it is. It's a very good term. I like solar communism.
Yeah, it's a good one. Another radical transformation in the transportation system by drastically reducing the use of private trucks and cars, replacing them with free and efficient public transportation. Third, present patterns of production, consumption, and building, which are based on waste, inbuilt obsolescence, competition, and pollution, by producing only sustainable and recyclable goods and developing green architecture. Nice. And lastly, food production and distribution, by defending local food sovereignty as far as this is possible, eliminating polluting industrial agribusinesses, creating sustainable agro-ecosystems, and working actively to renew soil fertility. So still some kind of umbrella ideas, I guess, but ones that have obviously, they have obvious sort of policy branches that could spring out of those roots.
Yeah, for sure. They aren't, I mean, you know, these are the types of things that you hear sort of like progressives trying to get at, but Löwy can state them in a lot stronger of terms because he's really committed to the entire transformation of society and not just sort of like reforms that make things better. So it's cool for that reason. Yeah, he has a few others that we can read off here really quick too. Some other things he wants to do. So not just clean capitalism, but he wants to completely transform the whole system because that's what socialism is all about. So some other things that we can change, sort of like the material changes that are very specific. Drastic and enforceable reduction in the emission of greenhouse gases, development of clean energy sources, provision of an extensive free public transportation system, progressive replacement of trucks by trains, creation of pollution cleanup programs, and elimination of nuclear energy and war spending. It almost sounds like the CNN list, but it's better, right? It sounds different for some different reasons. It's weird that he didn't say buy a nest. I don't know. The book wasn't written that long ago. Nests exist.
Anderson Cooper, call him up, you know? He'll help you out, help you fill out that list.
Yeah, for sure.
He also super doesn't like nuclear energy, and I'm fine with that. Just want to put that out there as a hot take.
Yeah. That's fine with me too. His critique of nuclear energy, I think, is in some ways it's just about ecology, but in a lot of other ways too, it's about his distrust of bureaucracy, which plays into the larger critique he has of, state socialism or big state communism or whatever word you want to use to describe like the Soviet Union and China.
Right. Yeah, that is a fantastic segue, unplanned, into talking a little bit.
I set it up.
You did. The alley-oop, we're dunking into how he breaks with regular Marxism. I think this is kind of where the book is both really interesting and also, I was talking a little bit, well, how did I put it before we started recording? I feel like I've been trained by a certain Marxist hermeneutical tradition to just not see some of the sectarian moves that Löwy wants to make as viable, but they're very important to talk about anyway, and some of them are actually still extremely good. Good to learn from, no matter what your Marxist tendency might be. So you might be wondering how ecosocialism is distinct from Marxism in general, and that's a really good question. And thankfully, Löwy has a handful of pages to kind of trying to disentangle ecosocialism from other kinds of Marxisms or like preceding historical Marxism. So I'll talk maybe about the first one real quick. So on the one hand, ecosocialism is like a pretty straightforward response to Marx's work. So ecosocialism is an alternative to what Marx himself calls the destructive progress of capital. And this is something that a lot of Marxist theorists are working out now, kind of going back to Marx and Engels. And they discover this really interesting ecological thread in Marx in particular. There's a lot of really cool stuff in the Monthly Review, which is a great socialist magazine where they're like always coming down with this stuff. But on the other hand, Löwy notes that there's a difference here with ecosocialism too. So his big defining moment for ecosocialism is that it rejects what Löwy calls productivism. And that's a good term for him to criticize the Soviet Union and kind of big state communisms that he thinks sort of just like they broke with capitalism as a political arrangement, but they didn't really break with the productive habits or patterns of capitalism. So they retain all kinds of habits that actually were really ecologically devastating. And in some cases still are, like in places like China and elsewhere. So that's kind of an interesting point and something for communists, I think, to think about.
I think that is a good thing for communists to think about. I also think that the way he kind of just... I mean, like, I don't want to defend the big state communisms because, I mean, if you're a person who's trained to sort of be suspicious of like of left communism, I'm like a person who's trained to be suspicious of big state communisms, but here I am defending them. It's also the case too that like Löwy, I don't know, there's a lot going on with that too, right? Like there are reasons that that like the Soviet Union felt like it had to like outproduce the United States. I mean, there was like a lot of stuff kind of going on culturally at the time, so it's not like these things are sort of like, you know, just irrational or something. They were reasons that they were, you know, acting, that they had to like really prove the strength of like a planned economy. Anyways, I'll take the critique still. I think it's still a good one. Why not? On this whole point, Löwy distinguishes ecosocialism from the big state communism. I don't know if big state communism is like a real phrase that people use, but I really like it right now. Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, TM. Anyways, he distinguishes ecosocialism from big state communism by trying to more closely ally himself with Marx instead of like, I don't know, like Marxist-Leninism or something. So he says this: moreover, they believe the aim of socialism, they being Marx, is not to produce more and more commodities, but to give human beings free time to fully develop their potentialities. To this extent, they have little in common with, quote, productivism. So there you go. That's what Marx and Engels are all about. You can go work somewhere in the morning and be a philosopher in the afternoon and then go fishing or whatever. I'm not a fan of fishing, so that doesn't really appeal to me, but the other stuff's fine.
Go play your Fortnite.
Go play Fortnite in the morning, Fortnite in the afternoon,
Fortnite at supper time.
That's the real Marxist vision of the world. You gotta get away from that productivism and just get into that Fortnite.
That's right. Yeah, that authentic need stuff is good, and I love that he pairs it with the biblical line here. I mean, Löwy has done a ton of work on liberation theology. He wrote a really good book called War of Gods that we've mentioned here before. So it's neat to see him kind of internalizing some of that, even though he's not a Christian himself. So that's cool. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how to satisfy those authentic needs. Löwy talks a lot about sort of strategizing how to meet them through democracy, which I think will give us a lot of things to talk about. Yeah, well, let me throw it over to you to introduce this. How does Löwy think that we ought to meet those authentic needs in an eco-social society?
Well, okay, so democracy is definitely sort of his mode of political change. And it's kind of complicated, I think. Like, listen, I love democracy as much as the next guy, but what Löwy's saying here is not entirely clear to me at all times, and it's a little bit confusing. So I think we can just kind of do our best to maybe work our way through it. Mm-hmm. And just try to get a handle on what he's trying to say. Because I don't know exactly. I don't know. I just don't know exactly what he's getting at every sort of step of the way. So,
that's good, because that's why I threw this over to you, because I didn't know either. So it's good to know that we're both feeling our way around here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, democracy, it's great. Love it. Everyone should try it. Löwy says this: Ecosocialists should take their inspiration from Marx's remarks on the Paris Commune. And this is not a quote from Marx, but just like, I don't know, like kind of like a weird paraphrase, I suppose. Not a weird paraphrase. It is a paraphrase for sure. Workers cannot take possession of the capitalist state apparatus and put it to work at their service. They have to break it and replace it with a radically different, democratic, and non-statist form of political power. Okay, so I was with him all the way up until he said non-statist form of political power, because that is not the Marx that I know and love. Dean and I were having a sort of pre-Magnificast talk about this, and there are folks, even folks who I really like, Marxist philosophers and theorists, who do read Marx as a non-statist, and I think that's cool, but I guess what's confusing to me is I don't really understand what non-statist political power looks like. Is that... What does that mean, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, trying to read it charitably, like, I can understand it in certain ways. He wants something that is... I mean, he quotes a number of theorists that he doesn't adopt their political philosophies per se, but he kind of, like, puts himself in their orbit. One of them is, like, Murray Bookchin, for example. I think that's helpful, because I don't want to suggest that, like, Löwy is saying the same thing as Bookchin, because he doesn't say that.
No.
But it's helpful because it's a kind of way of looking at how people organize themselves into radically democratic associations in theory, where they can sort of have conversations about how they want to imagine for themselves the political architecture that their local communities will take place, right? This is always, like, not just an anarchist point, but a sort of general left communist point that not having a state authority doesn't mean that you don't have any authority. Not having state power doesn't mean that you don't have any power. It just means that you don't have this specific kind or this specific model. And there's a part of me that can sympathize with that insofar as, like, you do have to break the bourgeois state. You do have to break, in the past, you have to break the feudal state or something and replace it with something radically different. But I mean, I guess I'm sort of convinced by the Leninist point that, like, breaking the bourgeois state and building a worker state isn't necessarily a bad thing, or isn't necessarily like the same, or something like that. Like, there is something kind of qualitatively different about that, even if there are some leftover things that need to be moved beyond, right? Like, all communists sort of think that it's just a matter of strategy of whether or not you think there could be an intermediate state between capitalism and a communist future.
Yeah, okay, I'm about to say something and maybe it will sound dumb, and if it does, I don't know, sorry. So I guess the whole, like, non-statist reading of Marx, like, I get it, there are, like, ways to read Marx as, more left communist than not. I guess, like, I just don't feel like the term non-statist is a difference that ends up making a difference when it comes to, like, sort of theorizing about about revolution or something. So, like, I don't know there's a difference between a bourgeois state and a workers' state. That is totally true, right? Because it's about who owns the means of production and all that good stuff. But like, I don't know what it means to really have non-statist forms of political power, because like, politics is about the negotiation of power between people, right? Like who owns what? That's politics. So like, even if you don't want to call it a state, or you want to say like we don't have a formal state, there will like even if you want to be completely like mutualist or something, like you still have like a statist form of power in the sense that like you're negotiating who does what and who owns what in some way. So just, I don't know, saying you're not a statist but you're still exercising power in an organized way just doesn't seem like it's like a difference that really makes much of a difference to me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, ultimately, I'm not convinced that the non-statist rhetoric is really worthwhile or, in my opinion, very like viable as a strategy anyway. But I also think it's weird because so Löwy has a real utopian streak in him, and I think for better and worse. Like, sometimes it can make him confusing to me, but other times I think like it's a really important thing that he's trying to inject back into Marxism again, this kind of like not being afraid to dream or to envision something really big, even if you don't have all the puzzle pieces in the right spots yet. That's a good impulse. But what's fascinating about this is, so this is a real utopian moment, right? You have to break the state, have this non-statist form of political power. But when he brings himself back down to earth, all the sort of reforms that he suggests always strike me as being like pretty statist reforms, or statist like solutions, even if they're more revolutionary. Like we were talking earlier about the kind of specific things that he says, right? It's hard for me to imagine like local associations of democratic deliberation, for example, figuring out how to like, I don't know, like eliminate nuclear energy and war spending on their own without like, rejigging the state entirely. So yeah, I guess I just feel sort of like it's a good utopian moment. I get the energy and passion behind it, but like I don't really feel like when push comes to shove, it helps us get where we want to go.
Or can you imagine like every sort of like radical democratic confederacy in the world like having like a democratically elected bus route or something? Like, I mean, that's ridiculous. Yeah. But like one of the things he's saying is like, we'll get rid of cars and have more buses. But like, you have to have, I don't know, someone has to make the bus decisions, guys. That's political power.
Yeah, I think probably my guess is he would say something like, yeah, like bus drivers should make those decisions. And like, okay, there's something to that. But also like, I don't know. I kind of feel like you should have a more unified body for a transition into a better kind of society. You can't just like necessarily leave everything to the bus drivers to get where you need to go,
Bus drivers making decisions on where the bus goes seems so bad.
I mean, Maduro was a bus driver, so they can let's not be we're pro bus driver around here.
I mean, I love bus drivers, but like, but wouldn't it be great if you could always expect the bus to come on time every day?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
Not that like bus drivers couldn't organize that themselves. I'm just saying that there should be like some type of checks and balances of like when the bus comes. It's kind of crazy. Okay, yeah. So the state thing is a little bit complicated, and I'm really worried about the bus. A little bit more on, I guess, what some of this democracy means. He says. He kind of gives like another sort of bulleted list. He says that democracy looks kind of like collective ownership of the means of production. Collective here meaning public, cooperative or communitarian property. B, this is like the second bullet. The first one was A. So I don't think I said that. Democratic planning, which makes it possible for society to define the goals of investment and production. And C, new technological structure of the productive forces. In other words, a revolutionary social and economic transformation. So, okay, that's fine. That's fine. If that's non-statist, that's fine with me. I'll call it that, but I know the truth.
Yeah, sure. He also says, like, a whole society should be able to sort of democratically choose what they want to do. And that's fine, but also I don't really buy the line that like everybody's kind of capable already of democratically choosing what's in their best interest. And he tries to anticipate that, saying like, yeah, of course, like there's going to be mistakes. But also like there's mistakes with state communism too. Like Yeah, I mean, you kind of just have to like choose your mistakes. Nobody's got like a killer app for how to like reorganize society. So I guess to me, like, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'll regret saying this later, but I kind of feel like the mistakes of a potential new state communist solution to like ecological genocide or something is like a preferable series of mistakes than the one that might be made by like loose associations of local democracies.
Yeah, for sure. It's also kind of like frustrating too, because again, democracy is good and people should be able to exercise it, but at the same time, like ecological destruction is a real pressing issue, and democracy does take quite a bit of time.
Right.
So I don't know. I would love the worker state to make that decision and just kind of get it done.
Yeah. Well, here's something that we might be able to talk about. The political program of the Communist Party of Canada. This might help us kind of think through this problem a little bit. Right. So Löwy takes certain sides in like inter-leftist debates about the Soviet Union or historical communism and that kind of thing, and like that's fine. Whatever. You can have your own hang-ups, and that's okay. And it leads him to make these like gestures toward democracy. But we should emphasize that like the ecological crisis is a problem for leftists of every stripe, right? Like radical Democrats or like left communists aren't the only people thinking about ecosocialism. So I think the program of the Communist Party is interesting because it has a section on ecology, and they're like pretty average Marxist-Leninists. So they talk a lot about environmental abuses related to the Canadian context. But here are like some passages about how they relate to the worries that Löwy has about like inheriting the legacy of communism and planned economies. So bear with me because these are like a few paragraphs I found that might take maybe a second to read, but I think getting us on the table will help us think through it a little bit more. So the program says, past socialist societies competing economically and militarily with the imperialist countries made serious mistakes resulting in severe environmental damage. An important factor exacerbating this problem was the suppression of discussion and debate by a number of ruling communist parties which blocked the possibilities of preventing or promptly correcting these errors so that socialism could be built on an environmentally sustainable basis. Such abuses of the environment are not, however, inherent to socialism because it is not a system governed by the drive for private profits. So, to me, that sounds like kind of dealing with a lot of Löwy's problems up front. The program goes on to say, Canada has some of the largest resource bases and remaining environmental reserves in the world, yet corporate environmental abuse and governmental inaction to halt and reverse such devastation threatens our lands, etc., right? So they're trying to like really pull this down to a local issue. And then they go on to say, labor's struggle for safety, health, and job security in the work environment is indivisible with the struggle to protect and restore the whole environment, and for a fundamental shift in thinking and economic relationships with the environment. The greater scale of capitalist exploitation and crises means that environmental concerns are now inescapably linked to working class living conditions, including in Canada. Parts of organized labor, particularly some resource-based unions, have bought into the corporate agenda that pits environmental protection against employment. It is of vital importance for labor and environmental organizations to recognize that the protection of the environment is in the long-term interests of sustainable employment and for communities to unite against their common enemy, monopoly capitalism. They say a lot more, but I think these are just a few helpful ways of getting some stuff out on the table. Just because, like, they are obviously intentionally inheriting the legacy of planned economies, and they think that there are some good things about doing that, and they're Marxist-Leninists. Like, they want a state, they want a statist solution in the short term, and that doesn't preclude them from kind of carrying some of the same concerns and even connections that Löwy makes. And I think it's just like important to realize that the ecological problem has, I guess, become a problem for everybody who is like a self-respecting leftist at this point, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't know, all of those paragraphs to me that you just read from the Communist Party of Canada, they just sound like a less humanist way of putting Löwy's opening point, or like, the argument that that the environment is like essential to human survival.
Yeah.
So good job, Communist Party of Canada. You're really thinking about it and doing great. You guys are looking great out there.
It's true. Looking real good. But I think, I guess the point I want to make is that, like, you can be a democratic centralist, for example, instead of being like a radical Democrat and still get some of the stuff done. And in some ways, like, what's new about eco-socialism isn't really that it's like actually secretly left communism, which you sometimes get the impression reading Löwy's book that that's one of the key differences.
Yeah.
I think it's actually more the case that eco-socialism is a broad tradition that's emerging, and it brings us back to questions of strategy. And it doesn't mean that we have to like relitigate the left all over again or anything, but I guess it's just to say that everybody's trying to work this out, and then we kind of have to work with our own traditions to see what's available there.
Yeah, I think that's good. Speaking of working within traditions and seeing like what's available, good, another good transition over here. So the first, like, I don't know, half of Löwy's book is really committed to getting to that theory that we've been going on and on about. But I would say the second half of the book predominantly is some really interesting kind of case studies about the eco struggles of both Latin America, sort of like as like a grouping of states, but also of indigenous people. And to me, this is actually, I think, the more interesting part of the book, because it basically reemphasizes all of the points he's just made, but with some actual case studies to kind of grab onto.
Yeah.
So it's at this point in the book where he starts talking a lot about Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, both the states proper, but also the indigenous people that live there. And I think it's really pretty, I don't know, it's pretty interesting. I think it emphasizes that, like, I don't know, we can talk sort of like, left Marxism, big state communism all we want, but like the folks who are really kind of dealing with this first and who are, I think, setting the tone for how we struggle with these things are indigenous people.
Yeah, for sure. And what's great about this line too is that it shows, I think, pretty dramatically the kinds of problems that Löwy theorizes at the very beginning about how not only do like green sort of capitalist initiatives need to drop the capitalism if they want to get anywhere, but socialists have to find ways of becoming more green, actually taking that on board in a serious way. And indigenous people are really like leading the charge based on like sheer needs of survival, to like force certain socialist governments to do that. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't listen to those interventions.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on the eco struggles of indigenous people, Löwy says this: indigenous communities have become the center of the struggle for the environment in Latin America. This is true not only because of their local actions in defense of rivers and forests against petroleum and mining multinationals, but also because they propose an alternative way of life to that of neoliberal globalized capitalism. So for Löwy, indigenous people and their resistance is important because like they are the people who sort of live closest to it, and I think are probably most affected by it. He gives a few examples of exactly how that's the case, especially when it comes to like the war of water in Bolivia and some other cases too. But also that like indigenous people offer something kind of interesting because they have a radically different way of life and haven't been subsumed into neoliberal globalized capitalism. Pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. And also true not only in Latin America, but in North America as well. I mean, Standing Rock is sort of the obvious example, maybe in the most recent like round of press coverage. But here in Canada, like, indigenous voices are hands down like the most vocal and militant people against like the expansion of extractive capitalism in Canada, which is huge. It's a huge industry. Extractive industry is like close to like 10% of the GDP of Canada. So I mean, there's a lot, working against those kinds of interests, and it's consistently indigenous people leading those kinds of struggles.
Yeah. So listen to indigenous people. Seems pretty straightforward, I guess.
Yeah, though I should say the strength of Löwy's analysis there is that he goes out of his way to offer like a ton of really concrete examples. Like, it's not as simple as him just being like, checking a box and being like, indigenous rights are important or indigenous voices are important. But he's like, here's like several cases where things wouldn't have progressed in the way that they did without indigenous people, or like, here are several cases where indigenous people tried really hard to stop this certain thing from happening or whatever. So it's not like an accidental thing. It's like constitutive of an eco-socialist approach.
Yeah, that's right. I think some of that becomes a little bit more clear even when he's giving critical support of some of those good Latin American countries that socialists like to talk about. So being a French Brazilian, Löwy turns to start talking about the examples of Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil, and sort of like what they are contributing to eco-socialism, or how we can kind of think about them in terms of both like socialist countries that have socialist policies, but also remaining like holding a little bit of criticism for them as well because of some issues. So Löwy says this: some countries, however, like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, have attempted to break with neoliberal policies and have confronted the interests of the oligarchy and multinationals. All these anti-imperialist and anti-oligarchic governments recognize the importance of ecological challenges and are disposed to take measures to safeguard the environment. However, all three of their governmental budgets remain totally dependent on returns from fossil fuels, gas and petroleum, the fuels responsible for climate change. The Venezuelan government has hardly examined this issue. The absence of a sizable and organized indigenous population at the sites of exploitation is one of the reasons for this lack. Certainly, by prohibiting industrial fishing, which destroys all marine fauna, to the benefit of small-scale fishing, the Chavez government took an important ecological measure. However, the exploitation of petroleum, which includes all its dirtiest forms, continues without interruption, and there are few efforts to develop alternative energies.
I think that's especially important in light of even what's happening in Venezuela right now, right? They put all their eggs in the oil basket, and when the oil industry, the winds sort of, went in the wrong direction for them, they ended up with a huge financial crisis. And I mean, the socialism has, I think, carried them through some really hard times for sure. But it's also true that having maybe tried a little bit harder to be eco-socialists earlier, they might have been able to sidestep some of those issues. I mean, this is like a common criticism of them, and it's for certain it's not, completely it's not like their fault or anything like that entirely, that's the case. Like, they shouldn't just be blamed for like the situation they're in based on like bad planning or something. That's not true. But it is true that basing your socialist economy on extractive resources is like not just ecologically dangerous, but it's also dangerous for your own like social programs.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a good critique. At the same time, it's just like at the same time it's hard because like, I don't know, that's what they have to work with. And
100%.
It was extremely helpful to sort of challenge those oligarchic and imperialist powers. Löwy even recognizes this a little bit later in the same section where he's giving critical support. Critical support is a great term too, to be like, it's just like, you're fine, but I have something to say about you.
Yeah, that's how I feel about this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of critical support out here. So Löwy says, it is reasonable for eco-socialists and anti-capitalists to support these governments, meaning the ones I just mentioned, whatever their limits and contradiction against their right-wing, oligarchic, and pro-imperialist enemies, but this can only be a critical support considering how far these experiences are from an effective socialist and ecological perspective. Surely it would be unrealistic to ask the governments of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador to immediately stop oil or gas production, since this is, at the moment, the main source of financing for their significant social programs. So yeah, I mean, exactly what we're saying. It's like hard to blame them, and that's like kind of where their money is coming from. But at the same time, it has its pretty clear drawbacks.
Yeah, and it's also especially true that like you shouldn't hound like those governments, for example, for using their oil profits to actually do something good, while like they are far and away not the main polluters on the planet. Like they are, still having based their economies on a bad like a bad productive situation, even still are not nearly the people you should be pointing your fingers at first if you're like upset about the state of the world.
Yeah, no kidding. Point fingers at the United States. Point fingers at Canada. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. What could they do? I mean, like, it's just sort of like a situation that they're in. The United States, though, has some different problems and contributors in different ways.
Yeah, it's weird, too, because a lot of the time people talk about those countries, but they don't go out of their way to talk about, say, a place like Norway, which is also based on lots and lots of oil. I mean, they need that extractive industry to fund a lot of their social programs as well. But there's a certain implicit, I think, generalized imperialist consciousness that holds, like, struggling socialist countries like Venezuela or Bolivia to a standard that they don't necessarily hold a place like Norway to.
Well, it's also white supremacy. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Norway is white people, so it's chill.
Yeah, so, I don't know, just an important thing to look at. And it's weird, too, that, like, Löwy doesn't even necessarily go out of his way to, like, go after Norway on these points.
Yeah, it is interesting, though. I mean, people in the United States are constantly pointing towards Norway as socialist in some way, but Löwy doesn't even give them time of day. Doesn't even critique them. No critical support.
Right. No critical support from Norway.
So high up on that list of actual socialist countries in the world or whatever, but they don't even show up in this book. So how socialist can they be?
Yeah, not very, apparently. All right. Well, we've talked a lot about socialism, but let's do a short pivot, very, very hesitant pivot to talking about some theology, or specifically maybe one theologian that I like in particular, Leonardo Boff, who's also a Brazilian, and I think, has some of the most interesting things to say about ecology. I guess I should preface this saying that, like, there's a pretty strong current of eco-theology that's being developed, and it could only be improved by dialoguing even further with eco-socialists, like Löwy in particular, to kind of help identify, like, where eco-theology is often trapped in, like, radical reformist measures, but doesn't go as far as a revolutionary measure. But Boff is not in that camp whatsoever, and I think that's why he's so important. So he wrote an article a few years back for the magazine Tikkun, or at least it got published there anyway, which is a great magazine, but the title of it is "The Earth Will Defeat Capitalism," and that might sound like a triumphant thing at first, but let me tell you, it is not.
Real big bummer, actually.
Huge bummer, the Boff brand bummer. All right, so here's how he ends the article after talking about how bad capitalism is. He says, "This process of excessive degradation could cause an ecological social collapse of Dante-esque proportions. The consequence would be that the Earth would definitively defeat the capitalist system, which would be incapable of reproducing itself with its materialist culture of limitless and individualistic consumption. What we have historically been unable to accomplish by alternative processes, that was the goal of socialism, nature and the earth would accomplish. The earth, in fact, would free herself from the cancer that threatens to metastasize throughout the whole organism of Gaia. Meanwhile, our task is within the system to widen the openings, exploring all its contradictions, to guarantee the essentials for subsistence, nourishment, work, housing, education, basic services, and some free time, especially to the humble peoples of the earth. This is being done in Brazil and in many other countries. Kind of weird to say that right now in light of the Brazilian elections. But he says, from the bad, we must take only the necessary minimum for the continuity of life and of civilization. He ends saying, and also, we must pray and be prepared for the worst. Probably not what you'd expect to hear from a theologian, ending on that kind of, like, dark eschatological note, but I think there's a lot of important things to mine out of here. I don't know, Matt, how does that article strike you?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I like it for all the reasons I like speculative philosophy, in the sense that it's like, well, humans, you'll all die someday and you'll be over and the earth won't care. And that's cool. I love that. That's kind of like a good humbling exercise, I think, for all of us. On the other hand, it is actually a really sort of Virilio-esque kind of quote, I think. Mm-hmm. Last week, it was last week, right?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Okay, good. We read that quote where, Virilio's like, the end of the world, that's not interesting to us. And I think it's kind of the same thing. I mean, what he's pointing towards here is something that really can't be of interest to us because we'll all be gone. But at the same time, the end is like the last paragraph that you read there too is like our task within the system is to widen the openings. Is that really a point of like figuring out what to do in the meantime?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what I like about this so much is that I think there's a tendency within theology, Christian theology, to just always go toward hope and like always be looking for hope, even if it's like the hope against hope or something like that. And like Boff has written a lot about hope in his own life, having had a really difficult one. But like the weird place that hope shows up in this article is basically like, well, justice will happen, even if that means we have to go for it to occur.
I think that insight though, that like justice will happen even if we have to go, is actually like what makes it so Christian.
Yeah, exactly.
It's okay, so this is like a maybe it makes me sound dumb because there are people that know a lot about theology listen to this podcast. But in my undergrad, we read this book called Improvisation by Sam Wells. Sam Wells is like a Duke University sort of, I don't know, not quite Stanley Hauerwas kind of guy, but sort of like that. He's just like
they're friends, I think.
Yeah, I think so. He's just kind of like a liberal theology sort of dude. Anyways, at the end of so he has this book about improvisation, about how like church is kind of like improv, and it's like a thing that I read in my undergrad, and that's all I'm trying to say. But anyways, he breaks up sort of the biblical story into these acts, right? And the eschaton is the last one, and you know that like it doesn't matter what happens because it's sort of like the redemption of all things through Christ or whatever. And or whatever, but like this is like that eschaton is the eschatological moment where like the earth defeats capitalism. It throws off its oppressor in the sense that like all humans are gone and things are made right, and there you go.
Yeah, and I think that's the craziest part about it too, is that the other sort of Christian side to this is that you can't really stop justice. Like even humans can't stop justice. It's always gonna find a way to happen. And there's no reason that like it has to happen with us, even though we wish that it would or something like that. I think it's just also really, it's equal parts like troubling, but also motivating. I mean, Boff doesn't really give a lot of reason to feel like any of these efforts would be efficacious, right? Like widening the openings, exploring contradictions, guaranteeing these essentials, all that kind of thing. Those are all kind of like, I guess, like last days survival measures or something. But it's also like, those are things that you have to do. And I think that's the motivating part. Like you have to help people like get food and like live in houses and have some free time, right? Like these are all things that like, no matter when the planet gets too hot or whatever, you're still going to have to do that. And I think there's something really like, I don't know, like weirdly sort of courageous about that.
Yeah, I think so too. I like it. It's a good eschatology. Better than the rapture.
I mean, there are so many like Christian ways to respond to the climate change discourse, I guess, in the world. But I feel pretty convinced that at this stage, like, I mean, you can like stick your head in the sand, and I guess that's like what most Christians do in the United States, at least in particular. But I feel like the only real option open at this point is for Christians to like join socialist movements, right? Like, if you really want to like help be a friend to the earth or something, you should probably advocate for like the dismantling of an economic system that is forcing you to be enemies with it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that gets us that ecosocialism would get Christians so much further than like the, I don't know, eco-theology of the day. Yeah,
like the stewardship stuff or whatever.
Yeah, that's actually what I'm talking about. There's probably a good eco-theology, like Boff, but other people too are probably good. But like, I don't know, there's a really popular book sort of in my Christian milieu over here called Salvation Means Creation Healed. Mm-hmm. And it is all about stewardship and like, making sure that we have the right hermeneutic when we're reading Genesis and figuring out how to like live within our ecological situation and not destroy it. And like really what it comes comes down to in that book that I specifically mentioned, and I don't want to speak about any other theology because it'd be too much for me. But like in that book specifically, there's like an idealism that is just like untenable in the sense where it's like, well, if we just say enough nice things about the way Christians should think about ecology, suddenly they will. And hasn't happened yet. And I know a lot of people have read that book. So it's just like, it seems like we need Christians need a more robust way of thinking through their orientation toward ecology, like materially, and not just sort of on the sort of theological and idealist level.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's telling too that like some of the most powerful eco-theology stuff that has come out, at least that I've seen, actually comes from anarchist traditions. Like people like Ched Myers or something like that. And like of all people, like John Zerzan is in dialogue with a bunch of Christian theologians about all this kind of stuff, like ecological collapse and everything like that. But that stuff always strikes me as sort of a non-starter. So I mean, I'm far more interested in like how a more pragmatic or practical like socialist approach to these kinds of things might be able to offer Christians like more analytic tools other than like rewilding or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I don't know, like eating berries is cool. Not saying you shouldn't do that. But it's not like it's also not a solution.
Yeah, I think so.
Also, I should add, like, so in a past life, I was really interested in biblical studies. And there is a really cool book by Walter Brueggemann called The Land. And it's just all about how the land appears in the Hebrew scriptures in particular. And one thing that he goes out of his way to explain is that the land has a lot of agency in the Bible. And it acts as basically like an instrument of judgment oftentimes, not just like the judgment of God, but also like it just is a judge in itself. It sort of judges the morality of the people that live on it. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that, like about how there's a kind of untapped like biblical language for how we think about creation that isn't just like stewardship, that sees creation as maybe like an inert thing that we have to like guard over or have dominion over, or however you want to like work it out. But instead, like creation is a thing that is like maybe sometimes dialoguing with us, but like right now mostly arguing with us. And like we will definitely lose that argument at some point. And there's something about that, right? Like we could be judged not just by God, but like by the planet itself. That's kind of what Boff is after. So finding ways to, I guess, go back to like some of these roots, like some biblical roots, but also the roots of like Marx, and put these kind of ecological impulses together, I think is something that should seem supernatural. Should seem really natural, not supernatural.
This reminds me of that one time in the office when Michael says, I'm not superstitious, but I am stitious.
That's right. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard and you want to support us, you can do that on patreon.com/themagnificast. Really appreciate all your help there. We managed to make some really cool pins and mail those out, so keep those pictures coming. It's cool to see them out in the world and where they end up, so pumped about that. You can also find us elsewhere on the internet. We're on Twitter at The Magnificast. We are on Facebook. We've got a discussion group called The Magnificast Basement. You can follow up on things we've said on the show, or read some other articles that other folks are posting. And just keep building some spaces for Christian leftists to talk to each other. That's one thing we're trying to do there. Let's see. We have our music made by Amore Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, which, by the way, is a great band to listen to on this topic of ecology and Christianity. They come out of this sort of anarchist Christian exchange that I was talking about earlier, but it makes for some amazing music, and the themes that they explore are really creative and fascinating, and they deserve all your support and help. All right, we'll see you next week.
get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.